Hello, everyone. Before we get cracking, welcome to Australia at Home post-Easter. Like all of you, I'm on Indigenous land. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Like all of you, I do pay my respects to leaders past, present and emerging, and recognise that the land we're on was never ceded, never given up, and injustice continues to this day. We're making a weekly fist of this, trying to make sense of the political context that we find ourselves in, and we've decided to rebrand our discussion the GeekFest because we want to get right into the numbers and try to make some sense out of it. My partner in crime every week, Katharine Murphy, is with us, and thanks for joining us, Katharine. And we've also got our in-house geek, John Remington, who will be managing the chat if people want to ask him questions. And we've also got a special geek guest today, one of my favourite septologists, who goes under the handle the Pole Bludger, otherwise known as William Bowes. So thanks for joining us, William, and we'll get you into the discussion in a little while. We're running the Essential Report every week, and this is an opportunity to dig into the numbers that you see in The Guardian in the mornings. Hopefully a lot of you are return visitors and you know the rules. We're encouraging you to firstly identify yourselves in the chat and sort of start your own off-Broadway conversations. If you've got questions for any of the participants in this discussion, ask them in the chat and you might become a participant yourself before you know it. Switch your camera on if you can, if you've got the technology. Go into gallery view so you get a sense of the room. We've got about 200 people in here at the moment, I think. And help us make things up as we go along, because that's kind of what this whole project is about. We're all going through this amazing moment in history and all trying to make sense of it. And particularly those of us that are in the cheap seats and doing it from home, we're trying to do it together. So on that note, I'll welcome Katharine and check in. How are you going this week?
Hello, I'm going pretty well, thank you. I'm grateful for a small amount of downtime at Easter. Hope everybody tuning in today got 5 minutes to, eat some chocolate or walk in an appropriately socially distant way, or however you passed your time. So, yeah, I'm doing all right, Peter. And you, how are you going?
Well, I decided on the advice of all the health authorities to get my flu shot on Thursday, but I actually got the reaction. So I spent Friday and Saturday with man flu and I was groaning in bed for 48 hours. I realised I've never had the flu before in my life because I've never felt that bad. And then, you know, I'm good again, but it's made me pretty determined I'm not going to get any other flus this year because it was a pretty horrible experience.
Yeah, real flu is horrible.
Not good at all.
Yeah.
Anywho, I thought this week's report was really, really interesting. And what we're going to do today is go through different parts of it, have a bit of a chat, come back and forwards with the audience, and obviously also ask William for some of his thoughts. So I'm going to do the awkward sharing moment now to get the poll up on our screen. Am I up there, guys?
Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to go into slideshow. It's about our 4th week in a row. And I thought I'd kick off with a question we asked before the last federal election, which at the time gave me pause to wonder whether Australia really had the baseball bats out, which was on general levels of happiness. Now, this is a fraught sort of question because we're asking people to rate a bunch of indicators out of 10. But what's come back today is that despite everything that's happened, at least the way we are reporting our view of the world, we are not demonstrably less happy than we were 12 months ago. So go figure.
Well, I do figure, and I don't know, Peter, I've got a slightly different interpretation of these numbers, although sort of, everything's relative. Like a couple of things. Obviously, we are happy. We're not miserable, obviously, because otherwise these graphs would be at the other end of the spectrum. But if I was a participant in your survey and I was answering this question about whether or not I was happy, I wouldn't be saying I'm 6 out of 10. I would be saying I'm 8 out of 10, right? So, and also I think that the comparison's interesting, right? Like we, as you just said, right, we're comparing these numbers where we were last May, which is election month, and there's no big difference. But the question I would have is whether we're really that happy now, or whether we're more meh, and whether we were in fact meh last year as well, just before the election. Now maybe I'm nitpicking here, but if we go through these bars, I think they're actually quite interesting, right? So life overall, nearly 7 out of 10. Families, clearly we like 7 out of 10. That's nice. Spiritual life, one would imagine that was more or less stable. Then we've got social life, work life, financial situation that's just kind of cranking over a 5. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying we're unhappy, Peter. I'm not saying we're unhappy. I'm just not signed up to the happiness complex here in this conversation.
That's fair. We'll go into this a little bit deeper. One thing I would say is that we've also been running these online focus groups, and I did pick up a change in mood last week, which was kind of to put the views of 20 people into the one sentence. It's like, you know what, we're doing okay. We think this is working. And I got a sense that there's something going on amongst the public where all of a sudden, when they're talking about the government, they're using terms like we, which I've never heard before. When I've been doing political research. That's kind of interesting.
And it's, well, and definitely, I mean, as we go through the numbers this week, we can see that people are happy with the government's response, and that level of well, pleasure is a stupid word, but a level of affirmation about the government's response has sort of is ticking up week by week. So obviously, you know, the stability, I suppose I'd put it this way, the stability of these figures year on year suggests, as you said, like the overarching kind of assessment is that this pandemic hasn't thrown us into a massive personal tailspin, that people are resilient, that people are just absorbing this event and remaining broadly positive about it, with the benchmark of the feeling 12 months ago. And that feels about right to me. And it's consistent also with a couple of other things in the survey, which I'm sure we'll get to as we go through it. The numbers this week say to me that people are have some confidence in the way that the government is responding, what governments are responding, and also the degree of personal anxiety about how serious this illness will be is also sort of tapered off slightly, which suggests that they think that the threat isn't as profound as it was a couple of weeks ago, which forms a little feedback loop with the government's response, right? People think that the measures are working and affording them a degree of personal protection.
Let's flick through a few more of the slides. I think that's right. And I think also the other point is we're looking at what's happening in different parts of the world. And it's clear that at least in this first wave of infections, the measures Australia have taken has left us in a demonstrably better position than some of our neighbours and other countries in the world. We did have a bit of a focus this week on how we're socially dealing with the isolation. Hardly surprising, large number of people spending more time on all their devices, these sorts of online group catch-ups. We are finding ways to connect. Part of me just wonders how different this would be if we didn't have connectivity. It does sort of give us a bit of a cheat, so we're not all just sitting in our homes. Interestingly, about a third of people doing nothing different. But and then this one's probably a bit more talks to some issues. You know, you've got 12% of people who are saying they feel isolated or struggling to maintain their daily routines. So,
yeah, it's an interesting question that you pose about technology. How would we be managing this issue if we weren't able to have workarounds? Like, I don't know what others in the group did at Easter time in order to catch up with extended family that may not be in the same city. But, you know, I had a Skype call with my mum and my sister, and also had a funny FaceTime session with my daughter who lives in Sydney, who was with her flatmates attempting to roast the first chicken of her her cooking life. She hadn't done a chook before this weekend, and we had to have a FaceTime tutorial about that. So, you know, and all of that makes you feel less bereft, obviously, when you're separated from people. It is an interesting thing to roll around in your mind how we'd be feeling if we couldn't contact people, including with face-to-face interactions like the ones we're doing now.
Yeah, no, I think this has been a fantastic tool, this kind of video conferencing device that gives everybody a face, and demonstrably better than just a TV or a Facebook feed, in my opinion. And look, none of this is to diminish the huge human impact. I see, Lisa, folks on the chat there making the point that the finance happiness isn't great, and that's true. And there is a huge cohort of people that have lost their employment, and the figures out today suggest won't be back in the workforce anytime soon. So, you know, as we've said, you've got the health wave, the economic wave, and the social wave. I guess the point here is that, at least in terms of the social part of it, people seem to be making a fist of it and finding a way through. And, you know, we're in the early stages of what's likely to be a marathon. So we may all go stir crazy in a couple of weeks and these numbers turn around significantly. But you've got to say, at the moment, even on this slide here, over half the people asked are basically saying they're doing okay.
And it's sort of just to quickly, because you want to rip on, but it's an interesting sort of contrast too between, you know, the community broadly being sanguine about what's happening, albeit, you know, everyone's feeling it in different ways, and that cohort that you've pointed to then, the 12% who are feeling really isolated and struggling to cope, which is obviously really heartrending and difficult. And you can see that there would be people who didn't have the benefits of technology in order to maintain contact with their loved ones, or have fractured relationships with their loved ones, or have, you know, anxiety and depression and other conditions that would make managing this crisis really difficult. So, like, there's a whole spectrum of stuff. But anyway, the point was the community is sort of broadly sanguine, but I note I'm tuning in and out of daily media at the moment, because if you were here last week, you know, I'm doing a bigger project, so I'm out of the daily cycle at the moment. But it's there's this drumbeat in the media starting about you know, the overreach of social distancing measures. Like, that commentary starting to come through the media cycle, and we see some contention sort of building into the news cycle about that. But it's sort of looks like the community is broadly just getting on with it, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I've sort of picked up, there's almost a sense the media wants to keep the story moving on because that's what the media does. I think at the moment, at least what we got out of particularly our focus group last week, was people just feeling like they're doing what they can to stop people dying, and that's a pretty good thing at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we come up for air, and I feel like we've all been in this graph for about 10 minutes now, and we're probably going to suffocate in a sec, I did want to just go to a couple of the benchmarks we've been running every week. So the first is government response. The quite good and very good are now combined at 63, which is as high as it's been. That's the heavy blue lines on the left side of the page. So again, I think that notion that government now is we, and it's not necessarily seen through partisan lenses, is pushing those numbers up a fair bit. And the other benchmark that we did spend a bit of time commenting on in the early days, you can see if you go from left to right on whether people think the government's response has been about right, an overreaction or an underreaction. It's really solidified in the about right column, like 60%. And the overreaction, which at one point was 33%, down to 13%.
Yeah, fascinating. That turnaround, really fascinating.
Yeah. So at this point, I'm going to try to come up and get some oxygen and introduce William, because he follows other people's polls like nobody else does. And the Poll Bludge has been a long-term project. I think I saw you've been blogging, William, since 2003. But what have you learnt looking at all the polls over the last, you know, couple of weeks, months, and where do you think these findings fit in with your general observations?
I think the interesting comparisons to make, obviously, are internationally. There's been quite a lot said about, Donald Trump's spike in his approval rating. But if you compare that to leaders internationally, certainly including Scott Morrison, what's remarkable about his declining fortunes? Sorry, may I ask if I'm coming through clearly on the audio?
Better now.
Yeah. Donald Trump has had a remarkably small bounce out of this. Internationally, we're seeing what everyone's calling this rally around the flag effect. Last week, your poll looked at approval ratings. Scott Morrison was up that 20%. That is at the high end of the international spectrum. Most international leaders seem to be in the 10 to 20% improvement range. Scott Morrison's probably doing a bit better because he's coming off a slump. But overall, Scott Morrison, is having a good academic, if I might say that, in terms of his political standing. And what we're seeing in this poll is, as we saw just then, a continuation of a trend in which the public is satisfied with the government's response. An interesting thing that I don't think we're up to this slide yet, but we're about to see that there has been a drop in the number of people who think there has been an overreaction. Did we look at that already? Yeah,
we did. That was the last slide we did. So, yeah, that's down to 13%.
Yeah, so and also people are now less worried about the virus. Not, in relative terms, there's still a high level of concern, but I think this is the first poll in your series where there has been a reduction in the level of public concern. That, however, has not translated into a feeling that there is being an overreaction. What that suggests is that there is a feeling that the government is getting this right. That, the measures, the reason people are less concerned is that there is a sense that what the government is doing is working and that it ought to stay the course. So, and I think by any international standards, that's a good result. The one sort of qualification I'd make is that the polling that came through last week from New Zealand was even better and rather a lot better, actually. The government is seen to be doing spectacularly well in New Zealand and having a really remarkable rush of goodwill. I think the overall trend that you're seeing internationally is that the more firm and decisive governments are being in their actions, the better a polling response that they're getting. So Donald Trump, who was, sort of all over the shop, is getting a very wishy-washy sort of a poll bounce. And within the United States, the only leader I'm aware of who has had a fall in their approval rating, I haven't looked at every leader in the world, but the only one I've seen is Ron DeSantis in Florida, who famously kept the spring break open, and we saw all of those videos of frat bros, partying on during the start of the coronavirus epidemic. It's only a leader who has really sort of conspicuously been seen to have been too relaxed, who seems to be going backwards in their polling. For the time being, at least, the firmer governments are being, the more favourable the government response. But you've got to keep making that point that it's early days and come back in 6 months and we'll see how people feel then.
Thanks, William. I've got to say there were quite a few people in the chat saying they were struggling to hear your work. So while we go and have a bit of a chat amongst ourselves, if you do have a pair of headphones you can plug in or a different mic, that would be fantastic. But I think the point William was making in and out of the waves of noise across the Nullarbor, Katharine, was that, globally, leaders have benefited, even Trump to an extent. And it is a bit challenging to see where Morrison's sort of uptick in approval that we saw last week fits into that, that global trend.
Yeah, well, we sort of, we had a chat about this, I think, briefly last week, Peter, I think, or perhaps it was even the first session, I can't remember now, but it's, I think there's, in part, there's a sort of powerful incumbency effect that wouldn't be surprising to anyone, because everyone kind of got a bit of a rally, although there was a bit of a lag in Morrison. And that sort of points to the sort of truism in politics that in anxious times, in crises, then incumbents benefit from being in power, that there's a sort of, there's just a dividend there that exists regardless of your approach to an issue. But now, as time has gone on, I think William's point is that we've seen sort of some leaders pull ahead, so that there appears to be a sort of a direct marking of performance rather than just I feel quite anxious. I know this political leader, and there's a level of comfort in the fact that the guy or the woman I'm familiar with is standing at the front of this crisis. I don't really understand why that happens. I really don't, but that does happen. So, but now we're seeing marking on performance, and I think, as William said a minute ago, Morrison, of course, is coming off a big slump in his approval, which was caused by the perceptions that he mishandled the bushfires, right? So he's had a slump, and now he's kind of accelerating off a slump. Now, how long that lasts, I think, is a function of what he does, and because now we're in the territory, I think, as I said a minute ago, where people are marking actual conduct, actual performance, rather than just a general sort of incumbency dividend. So, maybe it continues, maybe it accelerates, maybe it doesn't. Depends on what the guy does.
I'm going to just throw one more slide in and go back to awkward sharing for a moment, because we also this week had a look at state and...
Yeah, this is interesting.
Yeah, and look, I wouldn't get too excited about... Oh, that was the wrong one to hit there, wasn't it? Slideshow. I wouldn't get too excited about the actual numbers on this slide, because some of them, particularly the smaller states, the samples are pretty low. Where have I gone?
You went past.
Here we go.
There you go.
But there is differences in states, and it's clear that now WA is a pretty small sample, so I'll take that with a grain of salt. But particularly Victoria and New South Wales are representative samples of around 300. So you can see there that the Andrews government at 75% has really got the public behind them. In comparison, the New South Wales government's struggling for public confidence.
Well, there'd be just a couple of things, and with the caveats you've already mentioned, right, that there's noise in these numbers because it's low sample sizes, but it sort of makes intuitive sense in that in New South Wales, there's been the rolling controversy of the Ruby Princess cruise ship and the perceptions that both the New South Wales government and the federal government mishandled that, and that's had a tangible impact on the number of coronavirus cases. So I think that was really very, very difficult for Gladys Berejiklian. That particular incident was bad, and it has continued to cascade through the news cycle. Whereas in Victoria, Andrews, hasn't had any sort of equivalence, a Ruby Princess equivalent event, and was of the premiers, and I know this because as part of the research I've been doing, I've been looking at what people have been doing at different times. Andrews was really the first premier out of the blocks to signal that we were heading into a period of semi-lockdown. That happened on the 10th of March, which was before those lockdowns were decided at the COAG meeting later that week. And he's had a very consistent message throughout. Now, I'm not saying a perfect message. There's controversy in Victoria about how the police, for example, are dealing with the public health directives. Like, no politician is infallible, but he's had a consistent and clear message throughout, whereas not every state jurisdiction or Morrison federally have been as clear and consistent, particularly at the beginning.
Do we make anything? I know, again, the sample's okay for Queensland, but they're the first state that's going to be tested at the ballot box later this year. So are you picking up anything from Queensland in your...
Well, again, they were very. I talked about Andrews being out in front, and he absolutely was. But the state that actually moved first to declare the public health emergency was actually Queensland. That happened in late January, and that happened because there were a cluster of cases in the southeast on the Gold Coast. They had a man from Wuhan in Queensland who was their patient zero. But it's sort of, again, I think the messaging in Queensland's been a bit complicated because there was a local government election period that happened where Palaszczuk and others were sort of, because obviously that election cycle went on even through this. And I think she was a bit muted in the run up to that. And then I think Queensland got a bit more vocal after that local government election cycle. So, but as you say, there's election coming up in that state. So it'll be quite interesting to see how that washes through the system in Queensland.
William, do you want to see if your mic's now doing justice to yourself and see if you want to throw anything?
Is it?
Much better.
Oh, good. Because I want to continue on with what Katharine was saying, because it sort of helpfully meshes with some of what I think went missing during my last audio failure, which is that internationally, polls are going better for leaders who are being, someone in chat just used the term clarity and consistency. Currently I'm still no good. Am I being heard okay? No.
Not good enough, I don't think, unfortunately. If we don't get it working today, we will have you back because I reckon we're going to be in lockdown for a few more weeks. Why don't we move to... Why don't we move...
my thoughts in chat.
Yeah, that's a great idea, William. And I might actually ask John, as I come out of our share, if I can work that, to tell us a little bit about what's going on in the chat, and maybe we'll get a few people to ask some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yeah, there's been some good questions coming in. Some questions really talking about who we're speaking to in these polls, whether or not it's just Guardian readers and how representative we are of the country. So just very quickly, we do speak to all people across the country. So we use the official census data from the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and we make sure that the ratio of men to women that we speak to by age groups, by state, by location, all match what the ABS recorded in the last census. So as much as possible, we aim to be representative of Australia. Now, that is to say that there were some questions about more vulnerable groups and whether or not we are able to fully account for them. And where possible, we do, but in some cases, and this was mentioned in the chat, whether or not homelessness and other perhaps vulnerable cohorts we do manage to get to. We can't always guarantee that, but where possible and where the official statistics exist, we do check back to try and make sure we're as close, we are as close as possible in matching that.
Thanks for that. A few questions coming through, and obviously if somebody wants to come and ask personally, they're really welcome to. Guys, Massimo had a really interesting question about some of the social aspects of the lockdown. Have we got them on the line?
Yep, you hear me?
Yeah, hi.
Hey, good day. Thanks for this. It's my third session and these are really great to do while I'm at home. But yeah, I had a question on if there's any sort of research or public opinion yet about the what it's called social policing. So Saturday night I had a little barbecue and beers in my backyard. We had 5 people, 3 live here, 2 partners. The cops got called, they came over. They were pretty fine, but they RD'd us all, really put us through the ringer on who we were, where we live, what we're doing. And since then, our house has really been feeling a little bit uneasy in terms of we've got apartment buildings surrounding us and looking straight into our backyard and really feel quite, under surveillance from our neighbours who we can't really see. But, I live in Parkville in Melbourne. Melbourne is a pretty sort of affluent area and, a lot of privilege that we're all sort of white young professionals here. But we're just wondering, if there's been any research or public opinion yet on how how police are interacting with everyone.
Yeah, that's a great question. We had Ed Santo talking about some of these issues last week, the Human Rights Commissioner, and about that balance between basic human rights principles, and then what government can and should not do in a time of crisis. We had a discussion about some of the measures, particularly around the COVID-19 app in our focus group last week, and got a sense that people are kind of a little bit wary about the idea of actually being tracked. And we're going to put some of those questions into the report for next week. So that flags the sort of question that we want to be looking at, which I guess is what is appropriate community protection measures by police. Catherine, anything you'd like to add on that?
Well, I can't answer the research question that Peter has answered that ably. I've been really interested in the dynamic in my own community about that that sort of community policing that Massimo mentioned. I went to post something in my local LPO last week, and I stood at the right bit of the social distancing queue, but then moved off it inadvertently, and the woman standing behind me got really irate, really angry and concerned that I'd sort of strayed off the mark. And I just thought, like, sociologically, it was so interesting. It's sort of that, it wasn't a matter of the constabulary bursting through the door into the licensed post office that I was visiting, but there was this really high degree of attentiveness and agitation in the community, because I think you said, Massimo, your neighbours called the cops, right? Like, the cops wouldn't have been able to see people in your backyard. So I just think that's sort of fascinating as a phenomenon. It's not only just a matter of the Constable Plod fining, somebody for having a falafel on a park bench or whatever else. It's that we are actively policing one another, and there are sort of pluses and minuses to that. Obviously, it keeps everyone honest, and these social distancing measures are not being deployed for fun or in some arbitrary fashion. They're being deployed in the service of saving lives. But it's just interesting that we've got some little self-deputised police persons in our communities who are absolutely rallying to the cause. Anyway, I just think...
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We were even wondering if Daniel Andrews or the Victorian Police or whatever has actually instructed people to dob in your neighbours, or if this was just one judicious neighbour, because the cops did say one of your neighbours called us. So, but we don't even know if the public's been directed to do that, or that's just someone picking up that initiative.
Well, I don't know. Look, it's impossible to know, but I suspect actually it's people exercising their own initiative.
John, you had some interesting breakdowns also on different age groups and how they were dealing with the issues socially, because I do think when it comes to the social distancing, it does have a disproportionate impact on younger people whose social networks are really an important part of their lives.
Yes, that comes back to one of the early points we were talking about, and it is younger people who have really felt the shock, so your 18 to 34-year-olds. So they're the group who are most likely to feel socially isolated. They're the ones who are most likely to have engaged in something to try and manage or at least mitigate that social isolation, and probably the ones who have had more of a disruption to their daily routine and life as a result of the restrictions which have come in.
Great. There was also a really interesting question in the chat from Lisa Folks. I don't know if you're happy to step up at the moment, Lisa. We'll give you a second while our tech guys, otherwise I'll ask on your behalf. Now, there we are.
Yeah, look, it's just a question about, this idea that politics has changed forever now. We've had this massive social spending from a Conservative government. So I guess I'm interested in whether there's any evidence that we are that something has changed in the paradigm, whether we are all socialists now.
Shall I have a go at that, Peter?
Yeah, it's in your hitting zone, Catherine.
Yeah, I feel the need to. Well, look, are we all socialists now? No, I think is the short answer. I think it is interesting that there has been this sort of uptick in community support for the government's actions around a bunch of policy responses that you might want to categorise as centre-left policy responses. But we've had a conversation about that in this group before. I think, look, what I reckon about this is the key test of whether or not anything's changed in our politics, or in fact, if anyone wants anything to change in our politics, will come when the government begins the dismount from the bunch of measures that have been put in place. Now, obviously, a bunch of really important decisions were taken by the government in order to unleash the degree of spending that we've seen to try and cushion people and the economy from the economic shock of a pandemic. But the question is, how will the dismount be executed? And will the dismount be executed and everybody returns to type? Will ideology resurface? Will politics as usual resurface? Will this period just be seen in the future as a period in which the pause button was hit and then business as usual resumed immediately afterwards? I'm sort of, much and all as I'm an optimistic person, and much and all as I've been really, myself struggling with, can we reform politics? Can politicians take the opportunity associated with this crisis to press reset in all kinds of fundamental ways? The realist in me is more inclined to thinking that we'll see business as usual resume on the dismount. But, I'm speculating, obviously.
And I wonder, Katharine and Lisa, to what extent this will be a call and response between the government and the people. So we know that these guys didn't choose to become Keynesian, but it was the only public policy response at their disposal. I found it interesting after the global financial crisis how that deep-seated sort of narrative that a government is like a household and they need to get their debt in order, otherwise they're profligate, sort of, even though it had demonstrably got Australia through a crisis, then came back to roost. And I wonder if that's also going to play, like whether it's not just how government plays it, but how we play it on the way out.
That's exactly right. I was going to reinforce that point that you make, Peter. That's exactly right. It's not only because that, as you described post GFC, the sort of governments reverted to the sort of economic orthodoxy that had preceded the GFC, but communities were in an entirely different place, and we saw the rise of populism, the far right return in Europe, all of these things that basically were as a result of where the citizenry were at after the event. So there's two questions. There's a questions of where politicians and politics is at, and then there's a question of where communities are at.
There's a terrific comment / question from Lucy Temple as well. I don't know if she's online, Kayla. Otherwise, I will paraphrase. We're getting a nod.
Sorry, I'm here. I don't know that I put a question so much. I've just been commenting to people in the chat.
I just thought that comment, the difference between wanting to get back to normal, and do you want to just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the reactions I've been seeing in my community and through these sort of meetings is you kind of see people split between this is a temporary thing, we will put up with this for the moment because we need to, and the better we do this, we can get back to normal, how things used to be, versus people who were never happy with the way the world was. And I see this as an opportunity to reflect on our society and hopefully build a new future. So going back to what you were talking about, what comes next? How do we dismount this? You've got this push and pull that at the moment we haven't necessarily, like different people are having different reactions, whether they think this is short term, then we'll go back to normal, or let this be the beginning of a revolution and therefore optimistic for change.
Yeah. One other question came through, just to want to know a little bit more about our online focus groups, which also talk to that point a little bit, which is that the groups, we're running them every week, 20 people randomly selected from across Australia, and just checking in on how they're seeing the world. And they've been really interesting groups in that I think for a lot of people that are participating, they're kind of in an online discussion board, a little bit like this chat function here, but you really get the sense that people are actually putting their thoughts down in writing for the first time. And so we're getting quite raw engagement with people. And that was where we really picked up this sense that for all that, things are working here at the moment. We were being conditioned to expect a wave of deaths, which was far more than the less than 100 poor souls that have passed away to date. And I think the feeling we're picking up in a lot of this research is things are working. And, you know, we're already having discussions about what comes next, but in terms of the here and now, there's some really like in a way, it's working because we're doing nothing when we've been told to do nothing. So it's not a huge degree of civic difficulty, except it is because we're used to being social beings. But one of the questions I'm going to be interested in posing over the next couple of weeks and maybe into next week's report is whether this is also leading to an uptick in trust in our institutions, which have been on the slide over the last decade at least. I think since 2013, people's views of most of our public institutions have been pretty dire. So that will be, so this whole notion of trust, like the institutions have mobilised society and asked us to do certain things. We're doing it, it's working. Will that change the way we look at our social institutions? Katharine?
Well, it's an interesting question. That's a really interesting question. And I would be hopeful of a sort of, you know, rebound in trust. And we were talking about that a bit last week, that there is here, you can see there's a certain amount of rebound in trust, whether it's permanent or transient, I guess we'll find out. Just one other point I wouldn't mind chucking in, just and where the conversation's gone. I think one thing that was interesting too in the survey, and I don't think we did it in the graphs, Peter, but looking at the results from the 18 to 34-year-olds, just about employment and their concerns about, right? So just through that, was it Lucy before who was talking about a revolution? You know, fantastic. That's an interesting cohort to look at if you're talking about revolutions, right? Because obviously the 18 to 34-year-olds have been much more attentive on, you know, issues like climate change and other and issues of social activism, right? Like that's what the data has sort of told us. Then there's a kind of generational divide between younger people and older people in Australia and around the world on issues like climate change. It's very interesting to me that group in this crisis have now become quite focused on whether they're going to have a job or not. And that is probably the first time that, notwithstanding, you know, the fact that many people now, we've got, you know, a several tier labour market where there's people with legacy conditions, and then there's a bunch of people in the gig economy and a bunch of contractors. And so I'm not suggesting that people under 35 have just had always great labour market conditions and this is the first time they've encountered difficulty. I'm not saying that at all, but those materialist concerns are really evident in the survey this week, that young people are worried about their economic future. And I can say, you know, as somebody who lived through the recession in 1991 and came out, and that was when I was trying to find a job, those experiences are really salutary. They really impact you and the way you look at the world henceforth. And I think this crisis will be, for a number of people, their first encounter with a serious economic downturn in this country, and that will influence their decisions and judgments. Now, I'm not saying that will make them less keen on staging a revolution. You know, that might make them more keen on it. But it's just an interesting rebalancing of interests for people under 34. Now, again, how that story ends, we'll don't know yet, but that's really interesting to me.
It is, isn't it? The notion of post-materialism has been sort of one of those hooks that we've hung on the progressive movement, and this sense that there's identity politics and class politics and their separate roads, which have been the split on the progressive movement, and whether the class experience, the experience of having to find an income is actually the new organising model over the next period.
I'm just putting it out there.
It's a good. Is this a spoiler for the essay? It sounds like a bit of deep thought going on there, Katharine.
No. I'm just you give me too much credit on the deep thought. The thoughts are percolating away, but I think that's really interesting, and I don't know how the story ends. I think it's certainly something to watch.
We had a few more slides, but I feel like the chat's going in such an interesting direction. We might just keep it going. The last few slides, there was one I wanted to show, and then we'll come back to wind up. If people have questions they want us to put in the field, just put a few in the chat now. I'm just going to share one more slide, which is a new question we asked this week. And it's about, if people can actually read it, it's different things that we're concerned about, like areas of concern. Is that coming up okay? The Australian economy as a whole is the thing we're most concerned about. General unemployment, which reinforces what we've just been talking about. Physical health after that. Impact on super. And you can see that there's concern amongst all of it, but the ones that are sort of the standouts are economy, unemployment, health, and kind of, I think that sense that food and essential items is going to run out. It's still 23% very concerned, but dropping a bit. And then by no means the lowest, but still that sort of residual issue around mental health and well-being. So it just shows that there's a texted level, like it's kind of like we're worried about everything, but going back to the original statement, we're finding a way to get through at the moment. Yeah,
but also that those material, I mean, not that that's a radical shift. I mean, the economy in Australia always rates ahead of everything else, but I just think that those material concerns are coming to the fore for entirely logical and rational reasons, but perhaps in a way that we haven't seen here for a number of years.
Yeah, and we've still got 16% who say they'll be in serious financial stress with a short-term loss of income, and another 33% who'll struggle. That's half the population. That's huge.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think I've slided myself out today. Have there been any interesting requests for questions in the chat, John, that we might want to draw on to save ourselves a bit of work this afternoon?
Yeah, there's some good, interesting themes coming up, but always welcome. There's always time and welcome for more. One of the questions which we have had, really, do we have a sense of, for those people who are socially or economically struggling, how are their perceptions and how are they seeing things? And yeah, as you'd expect, it is pretty tough for them. So we have been asking whether or not people have lost their job during the downturn. And for them, and this is right back to the first slide, their happiness in terms of their financial situation and their work situation, as you won't be too surprised to know, is the lowest of any of the groups we're looking at. For the people who said they were in work but no longer in work since the start of the outbreak, we've got 46%, sorry, saying they will struggle, but they might just get by, and 26 saying they're going to be in serious financial stress. So for those people, and obviously they are majority more likely to be younger in that 18 to 34 group, financial issues are really going to be a concern for them. In terms of the questions, we did have a request about perhaps, and this comes back to the conversation you guys were having about the revolution in society, what policies as a result of the outbreak or progressive policies do you think would be more likely to be introduced or be accepted by the Australian population as a result of the outbreak?
Excellent. There was a really good question that just came through from Sophie McGrain. Is she up, Kayla, or you there, Sophie or Sophia?
Yes. Hello.
Come on.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Give us a question.
Yes. So sorry, there were a couple.
It wasn't the housing one, it was the one before that, but the chat's moving so fast now I lost track. Oh, the herd versus containment.
Yeah. That's, well,
the new class 4.
That seems to be the new class 4, yes. Well, it appears to be, the Australian newspaper seems to be progressing that point of view. And I just wondered whether that would be an interesting question to put to a survey, you know, what, you know, how people out there are perceiving this.
Yeah, it feels like the debate's been run and won in the public health realm. Don't know. It's kind of gone, hasn't it, that one, Katharine? Or do you think the herding is still there?
Well, no, it's sort of, I think Sophia's point is that there is, and we referenced this in the conversation a little while ago, that there is this sort of clamour in some of the reporting to, you know, to basically wind back the restrictions, and that's sort of seeping into some of the commentary and reporting around the traps. And you know, it's sort of part of creating conflict in the news cycle and also in public discussion. You know, we don't have a herd immunity strategy in Australia. We haven't pursued that. And I think Peter's point a minute ago was that there's the degree of public acceptance for the health measures seems to imply that people in Australia are pretty comfortable not having a herd immunity strategy. But there is this interesting dynamic starting to develop in some parts of the commentariat, which is partly business concern, fueled by business concern about how rugged an economic downturn is going to be for a range of corporate interests in Australia and economic interests across the economy. So I mean, it's a legitimate debate. We can't just decide these things through the prism of health measures alone, but governments in Australia haven't. I think they've sort of tried to walk both sides of the street. I don't know how you'd frame that as a question, Peter, because it's sort of, you're asking about something that isn't happening in a way. But anyway, maybe there's a way to do it.
That's why we pay John the big dollars. He'll work out. He'll work out something. We'll come back to you. There's a really interesting discussion in the chat about that as well. I feel like we might have time for one more question. If we got anyone in. Kathy Landvot, are you there? Otherwise,
yes, I'm here.
Hello.
Hello, I'll just get a picture up. Hello.
Hello.
Was that the question about leadership?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think bringing people together around a collective purpose has been working with the health messages, but over the long term, what kind of leadership, you know, how might it evolve in order to continue to bring people together around the health, but also more importantly around the economic and perhaps social impacts? You know,
yeah, great question. It's like, with health, we've said no one left behind, Katharine. That would be a novel approach to economics.
Well, as few, we haven't said no one left behind because we're not pursuing a strategy of total suppression or eradication. We're pursuing a sort of, well, I mean, you get into diabolical trouble with these terms, but it's sort of like a rate of infection at which the health system can cope, right? We haven't gone for total suppression. I mean, whether we will or whether we don't, I think is also part of the debate at the moment. But anyway, sticking that to one side, I think on the health front, Kathy, we're going to have these measures, or the basic social distancing stuff is going to be with us for a long time, because that at the moment is our only recourse against this illness. We don't have antivirals that have yet cleared clinical tests. We don't have a vaccine. And it's quite concerning to me that a lot of the public discussion assumes there will be a vaccine. There may well not be a vaccine. There are plenty of diseases, sadly, for which there are no vaccines. Peter talked about getting his flu shot a few minutes ago. There is a vaccine for the flu, but it's highly variable in its effectiveness. And I was talking to someone at the Doherty Institute a little while ago for my project, and she said to me, look, the only disease in human history that we've been able to eradicate via a vaccine is smallpox. That's it. So I'm not saying this to be a monumental downer. I mean, maybe the clinical trials will produce an effective antiviral that will reduce the death rate, and that's great. Maybe we will get a vaccine. There's a race on for this vaccine like no other race we've seen in our lifetimes. So maybe those things will work. But what I'm trying to say is that the basic health measures are going to be with us for a long time. And by that, probably 2 years or more. And so everyone's got to process that a bit. In terms of how you begin organising around economic principles, well, that's the sort of inflection point for that is the dismount that I was talking about before. It's how does the government step off this period, and what does it propose the future looks like at that period, economically and distributionally and all of those things. I don't know how they're going to dismount yet, but I predict that after the dismount, a whole kind of clamour will happen about what the future looks like, and some of that will be among the political class, and a lot of that will be in the community.
On that note, I don't know if it's a happy note, but a note that sort of gives us a longer season that I may have been expecting with Australia at Home. Thanks for your time, Katharine. Good luck with your research and writing.
Right.
Thanks, William. We will find a way of getting you in the discussion with a functioning microphone in the weeks to come. Thanks, John. We better get to work now, and thank you all for being part of it. As we say, part of the magic of this is people that turn up, and so it's really great to have you guys coming in every week or every day. The rest of the week, we've got a great program at 1 o'clock every day. Tomorrow, we're looking at the other virus, which is the racist virus, and talking to Jason Yatsen-Lee and the former Human Rights Commissioner, Tim Sipasamon. On Thursday, Sharon Burrow is going to be getting up at 4:30 a.m. in Brussels to share some time with us and talk about some of the things that are going on globally with the union movement to address the pandemic in corners of the world which we can't even imagine what's going on in comparison to where we are. And on Friday, we're going to be having a talk to some of the folks at The Guardian about some of the culture that's still surviving in this time of lockdown. So until then, as we say every week, stay safe, stay at home and stay connected. And thanks for being part of it today, and we'll see you soon.